The quantum alarm had been shrieking for exactly 17 minutes and 43 seconds when Commander Cassandra Vale finally admitted that her morning coffee was going to be lukewarm. Again. She pressed her palm against a bioscanner beside her captain's chair, silencing the cacophony that had been making her navigator's cybernetic implants spark with irritation. "Status report, Rodriguez," she called to the helmsman, whose fingers danced across holographic controls that flickered like aurora borealis in the bridge's dim lighting. "Unknown vessel approaching from Sector 77 Alpha, Commander. They're broadcasting on frequencies our translators can't quite decode, but the quantum signature suggests they're trying to say, hello, in approximately 4,000 different languages simultaneously." Vale rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar tension that came with first contact protocols. The Meridian's Edge had been stationed at the neutral zone for 3 months now, waiting for this exact moment, yet somehow she'd expected aliens to arrive during regular business hours rather than interrupting her attempt to enjoy synthetic caffeine that tasted suspiciously like recycled atmospheric processors. Visual confirmation. The main screen shimmered to life, displaying what could only be described as a ship that had apparently been designed by someone who thought physics were merely suggestions. The vessel appeared to be constructed from crystalline formations that bent light around them, creating optical illusions that made Vale's eyes water. Worse yet, it seemed to be changing shape as she watched, flowing like liquid mercury while maintaining structural integrity that should have been impossible according to every engineering manual she'd memorized at the academy. "Commander," interrupted Lieutenant Chen from the communications station, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant either very good news or very bad news, "they're requesting permission to board." The translation matrix finally kicked in, and apparently their leader wants to discuss the amusing primitiveness of human diplomatic protocols over what roughly translates to consciousness-altering beverages. Vale's eyebrow arched so high it nearly disappeared into her hairline. "They want to critique our diplomacy while getting drunk? That's the general idea, ma'am. Also, they've somehow managed to scan our entire ship while we were talking, and their leader seems particularly entertained by our charmingly archaic artificial gravity systems." The bridge crew exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective opinion of aliens who showed up uninvited and immediately started offering unsolicited reviews of human technology. Vale straightened in her chair, adjusting her uniform jacket with the precise movements of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of looking dignified while internally screaming. "Very well. Inform them that the Meridian's Edge welcomes their delegation, and that we'll be happy to discuss both diplomacy and our apparently hilarious gravity systems. Rodriguez, set us to yellow alert, but keep it subtle. Chen, activate the universal translators and pray they don't accidentally declare war when we try to offer them coffee." 20 minutes later, Vale stood in the primary docking bay watching as a section of the alien ship simply melted through their reinforced hull plating as if it were warm butter. No airlocks, no pressurization chambers, no regard whatsoever for basic safety protocols that had kept humans alive in space for centuries. The alien delegation stepped through what appeared to be a membrane of liquid starlight, their environmental suits dissolving away like morning mist to reveal beings that looked remarkably human except for their unnaturally elongated ears that tapered to elegant points. The leader of the group moved with the fluid grace of someone who had never questioned their place at the top of any food chain. Her silver hair flowed as if underwater, defying the ship's artificial gravity in ways that made the physics-minded crew members visibly twitch. When she smiled, Vale noticed that her teeth were slightly too perfect, as if each one had been individually crafted by cosmic artisans with too much time on their hands. "I am Ambassador Licenera of the Velferi Collective," she announced, her voice carrying harmonics that made the translator circuits hum with effort. "We have traveled many light cycles to witness the legendary ingenuity of humanity, though I confess our expectations were perhaps set too high based on your species' reputation for making do with less." Vale's diplomatic smile remained firmly in place despite the backhanded compliment. "Welcome aboard the Meridian's Edge, Ambassador. We're honored by your visit and look forward to productive discussions between our peoples." Licenera's attention had already wandered to the docking bay's industrial lighting, which flickered occasionally due to power fluctuations that the engineering staff had been meaning to fix for weeks. How quaint that you still require artificial illumination. Do all human vessels experience such charming technical difficulties, or are we simply fortunate enough to witness your maintenance cycle? Chief Security Officer Dmitry Kowalski chose that moment to step forward from his position near the airlock, his prosthetic arm whirring softly as servo motors adjusted to the sudden movement. The sound drew immediate attention from the Velfari delegation, who regarded him with expressions that ranged from scientific curiosity to poorly concealed amusement. Security escort reporting for duty, Commander, Dmitry announced in his characteristic deadpan tone, apparently oblivious to the way the aliens were studying his weathered face and mechanical limb. Should I show our guests to the diplomatic quarters, or would they prefer the scenic route through the parts of the ship that aren't having charming technical difficulties? Listenera's laugh was like crystal chimes in a solar wind, beautiful and somehow cutting at the same time. How delightfully authentic. Your warriors even come pre-damaged for our convenience. Tell me, brave soldier, do all humans accessorize with mechanical appendages, or did you lose a limb-drawing contest? The bridge crew tensed, waiting for Dmitry's response to what was clearly intended as an insult. Instead, the security chief's expression remained perfectly neutral as he considered the question with apparent seriousness. Actually, Ambassador, I won the limb-drawing contest. This arm can open jars that would take most people 3 tries and a towel for grip. It also tells time, plays 17 different musical instruments, and makes excellent coffee. The previous arm could only manage subpar coffee and basic manual dexterity. Clearly, I upgraded. The alien delegation's amusement faltered slightly as they processed this unexpected response. Listenera's smile became more fixed, as if she were recalculating social dynamics that weren't following the expected pattern. How practical, she managed, her tone suggesting she wasn't entirely sure whether she was being mocked or educated about human efficiency standards. We find practicality useful, Dmitry agreed solemnly. Especially when dealing with visitors who melt through hull plating without asking permission first. Our insurance policies have very specific clauses about unauthorized molecular phase shifting. Vale stepped in before the cultural exchange could deteriorate further into discussions of interstellar liability coverage. Perhaps we should continue this conversation in more comfortable surroundings. Ambassador, would you and your delegation care to join us in the observation deck? The view of Earth is quite spectacular, and our gravity systems work perfectly well there. As they walked through the corridors of the Meridian's edge, Listenera continued her running commentary on human technological choices, from the amusing inefficiency of their power conduits to the endearing simplicity of their atmospheric recycling systems. Her retinue followed behind, occasionally touching wall panels and exchanging glances that suggested they were conducting some form of analysis that didn't require obvious scanning equipment. Dmitry brought up the rear of the group, his prosthetic arm occasionally clicking in a rhythm that sounded suspiciously like he was tapping out an old Earth song. When one of the younger Velfari delegates asked about the sound, he explained that his arm had developed a habit of drumming when he was thinking, and that he was currently pondering whether alien visitors always arrived during coffee breaks or if this was just coincidental timing. The observation deck's massive viewport displayed Earth in all its blue-white glory, suspended against the star field like a jewel in cosmic velvet. The sight never failed to remind Vale why humanity had reached for the stars, and she hoped it might inspire similar appreciation in their guests. Instead, Listenera studied the planet with the air of someone examining a particularly interesting but ultimately primitive artifact. How charming that you still maintain emotional attachments to your birth world. Most species evolve beyond such planetary nostalgia within a few centuries of achieving interstellar capability. Most species probably don't have coffee shops, Dmitry observed mildly. Makes it harder to let go when you know there's decent espresso waiting for you at home. The security chief's continued focus on caffeinated beverages was beginning to have an oddly unsettling effect on the alien delegation, as if they hadn't expected human military personnel to prioritize refreshment logistics in their strategic thinking. Listenera's confident demeanor showed the first signs of genuine uncertainty as she realized that none of her carefully prepared cultural superiority demonstrations were landing with the expected impact. Vale watched the interplay with growing fascination, wondering if Dimitri's apparent obliviousness to alien condescension was brilliant psychological warfare or simply the result of consuming too much synthetic coffee over the years. Either way, the first diplomatic contact between humanity and the Velthari was proving far more interesting than any of the Academy training scenarios had suggested. The synthetic gravity in the observation deck hummed with a frequency that made Licenera's elongated ears twitch involuntarily, a reaction she tried to disguise by adjusting her flowing silver hair. The gesture fooled no one, least of all Dimitri, who had been quietly cataloging every micro-expression and physiological response the Velthari delegation had displayed since boarding. "Your gravitational manipulation systems produce quite fascinating harmonic resonances," Licenera announced, her tone suggesting she was delivering a lecture to particularly slow students. Of course, the Velthari abandoned such crude mechanical approaches to spatial distortion approximately 800 of your years ago. She gestured gracefully, and suddenly the ambient lighting in the observation deck shifted to accommodate what appeared to be a holographic projection materializing from thin air. The display showed towering crystalline cities that seemed to grow organically from planetary surfaces, their spires reaching toward alien skies while defying every architectural principle known to human engineering. "Our urban centers exist in quantum superposition," she continued, clearly enjoying the rapt attention of the human crew members. "Citizens can phase shift between dimensional layers at will, allowing for population densities that would crush societies dependent on fixed spatial relationships." Commander Vale leaned forward, genuine curiosity overriding diplomatic protocol. "That's remarkable, Ambassador. How do you manage infrastructure maintenance when your cities exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously?" Licenera's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for exactly that question. "Infrastructure, as you understand it, becomes irrelevant when matter and energy respond directly to conscious intent. Watch." She extended her hand toward Lieutenant Shen, who had been nursing a minor cut on his finger from an unfortunate encounter with a stubborn control panel earlier that morning. As her fingertips began to glow with soft bioluminescent energy, the wound on Chen's hand started to close visibly, cellular regeneration occurring at a rate that should have required weeks of natural healing. "Biological systems integration with quantum field manipulation," she explained as Chen stared at his perfectly healed finger. "Your medical technology appears to involve cutting people open and inserting mechanical devices, which is certainly creative." The entire delegation turned to regard Dimitri's prosthetic arm with expressions that mixed scientific fascination with the kind of horrified amusement typically reserved for ancient torture devices displayed in museums. "Cutting and inserting," Dimitri repeated thoughtfully, flexing his mechanical fingers. "That does sound unnecessarily dramatic when you put it like that. Though to be fair, the original arm was removed by an exploding fuel cell, not a medical procedure. The replacement was more of a practical necessity than a fashion statement. You allowed an energy containment system to detonate in proximity to your physical form?" one of the younger Velthari delegates asked, her voice rising with what might have been either horror or incredulous laughter. "Allowed is a strong word," Dimitri replied. "I was more focused on preventing it from detonating in proximity to 30 other people's physical forms. The arm was an acceptable trade-off for keeping my squad intact." Licenera's bioluminescent fingertips dimmed as she processed this information. Her species' concept of warfare apparently didn't include scenarios where individuals willingly accepted permanent injury to protect others, and the implications were clearly causing some cognitive dissonance. "Your military tactics involve deliberate self-mutilation?" she asked, her melodious voice carrying a note of genuine confusion. "Our military tactics involve coffee, contingency planning, and occasionally making hard choices," Dimitri corrected. The self-mutilation was more of an unintended side effect. "Like how your phase-shifting cities probably have really complicated property tax systems." The holographic display flickered as Licenera's concentration wavered, her perfect composure beginning to show hairline cracks. She had clearly prepared for this encounter by studying human military history, technological capabilities, and cultural tendencies, but nobody had warned her about the species' apparent talent for derailing serious conversations with observations about municipal bureaucracy. Property taxation is irrelevant when citizens exist in quantum superposition, she managed, though her tone suggested she was now questioning whether this conversation was proceeding according to any logical framework. Right, but somebody still has to keep track of who lives where, Dmitri pointed out reasonably. Even if where is a multidimensional probability cloud, there must be some kind of registration system. Otherwise, how do you deliver mail? Commander Vale watched this exchange with growing fascination, realizing that her security chief was either demonstrating brilliant psychological warfare techniques or simply possessed the most impressively practical mind in known space. The Veltheri delegation was clearly struggling to maintain their air of technological superiority while being forced to consider the mundane realities of interdimensional urban planning. Communication occurs through quantum entanglement networks that transcend physical location parameters, Lisanera explained, her voice taking on the slightly strained quality of someone repeating information from a textbook while being asked questions the textbook hadn't covered. That sounds expensive, Dmitri observed. What happens when the network goes down for maintenance? Do people just wander around in quantum superposition until somebody fixes the entanglement array? The younger delegate who had been so shocked by human surgical practices now looked genuinely distressed. Network failures are, theoretically possible, she admitted reluctantly. Though our systems are designed with extensive redundancy protocols to prevent such occurrences. Ah, redundancy, Dmitri nodded approvingly. Good thinking. We use redundancy too, except we call it, having a backup plan, and usually it involves either more coffee or bigger explosions, depending on the situation. Lisanera's holographic display finally collapsed entirely as her concentration shattered. The casual way this scarred human warrior discussed explosives as problem-solving tools was apparently more unsettling than she had anticipated. Her people's approach to conflict resolution likely involved sophisticated applications of biotechnology and quantum manipulation, not the straightforward application of controlled detonations. Your species appears to have an unusual relationship with destructive forces, she said carefully, as if testing the waters of a conversation that had drifted far from her prepared talking points. Not destructive, Dmitri corrected. Enthusiastically rearrangeable. There's a difference between destroying something and convincing it to exist in a different configuration than it was previously maintaining. The security chief's mechanical arm whirred softly as he gestured toward the viewport, where Earth hung in all its blue-white glory against the cosmic backdrop. For instance, we convinced several million tons of refined metal to exist in orbital configuration rather than remaining distributed throughout various planetary mining sites. Same atoms, different arrangement, much better coffee delivery potential. Vale realized she was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of interstellar diplomacy, a first-contact scenario where the allegedly primitive species was making the technologically advanced aliens question their fundamental assumptions about civilization, warfare, and municipal services through the simple expedient of asking practical questions. Lisanera appeared to be reaching the same conclusion, though from a significantly less comfortable perspective. Her delegation had boarded this human vessel expecting to encounter charming barbarism that would confirm their species' inherent superiority. Instead, they were being forced to defend the logical coherence of quantum superposition cities by someone whose primary concern seemed to involve caffeinated beverages and efficient mail delivery. Perhaps, she said slowly, we might demonstrate some of our more advanced capabilities. Your warriors interest me, particularly their apparent comfort with improvised solutions. The way she looked at Dmitri while saying this suggested she had finally decided to abandon subtle condescension in favor of a more direct approach to establishing Veltheri's superiority. Her elongated ears had stopped twitching, and her bioluminescent fingertips were beginning to glow again with soft, pulsing light that seemed to resonate with frequencies just below human hearing range. I would be interested to observe how human military personnel respond to situations requiring more sophisticated tactical thinking than the application of explosive devices, she continued, her voice regaining its earlier confidence. Dimitri's expression remained perfectly neutral, though Vale noticed his prosthetic arm had stopped its rhythmic clicking and was now perfectly still. "That sounds like fun," he said mildly. "What did you have in mind? War games? Tactical simulations? Competitive coffee brewing?" The fact that he had somehow managed to include coffee in a list of potential military exercises seemed to be the final straw for Licenera's carefully maintained diplomatic composure. Her laugh this time carried a sharper edge, like crystal chimes being struck just a bit too hard. "I was thinking something more. Revealing of true capabilities," she said, her glowing fingertips now pulsing in patterns that made the observation deck's quantum sensors start registering energy fluctuations they weren't designed to interpret. The ship's training bay had never hosted an interstellar diplomatic incident before, though given the way Licenera's bioluminescent fingertips were now casting dancing shadows across the reinforced bulkheads, Vale suspected they were about to break new ground in several uncomfortable directions simultaneously. "Your combat simulation chambers are admirably primitive," Licenera announced, her silver hair flowing as she moved through the space with predatory grace. "The Velthari abandoned such crude physical training methods when we learned to interface directly with quantum probability matrices. Shall we see how human warriors perform when faced with opponents who exist in multiple dimensional states?" The younger delegates had arranged themselves in a semicircle around the training area, their elongated ears twitching with anticipation. One of them was making subtle hand gestures that caused the air itself to shimmer with barely visible energy patterns, while another seemed to be conducting some kind of scan that made the ship's internal sensors hiccup every few seconds. Dimitri stood in the center of the training mat, his prosthetic arm hanging loosely at his side as he surveyed the gathering alien audience with mild interest. "Before we start," he said conversationally, "should I be concerned about accidentally damaging any quantum probability matrices? Our insurance doesn't cover interdimensional property damage." "Your concern is touching but unnecessary," Licenera replied, her melodious laugh carrying harmonics that made the training bay's acoustic dampener struggle to maintain equilibrium. "Human capabilities are insufficiently developed to pose any threat to Velthari biosystems." "Good to know," Dimitri nodded seriously. "In that case, would it be possible to borrow one of your dimensional interface devices? I have a theory about quantum resonance frequencies that I'd like to test, but our equipment isn't sophisticated enough for the experiment." The request clearly caught the delegation off guard. Licenera's confident smile faltered as she processed the implications of a human warrior asking to borrow advanced alien technology for theoretical research purposes. "You study quantum mechanics?" she asked, her tone suggesting this possibility had never appeared in any of her pre-mission briefings. "Not exactly," Dimitri admitted. "I study music theory, which turns out to have some interesting applications in quantum field manipulation. Though I suppose you could say I approach it more from an artistic perspective than a scientific one." Commander Vale felt her eyebrows attempting to disappear into her hairline. In all the years she had known Dimitri, he had never once mentioned having artistic interests beyond his legendary ability to make coffee that defied the laws of physics by actually tasting good. "Music theory," Licenera repeated slowly, as if the words were in a language her universal translator was having difficulty processing. "Pattern recognition, harmonic relationships, resonance frequencies," Dimitri explained, walking over to a storage locker and retrieving what appeared to be an ancient wooden violin case. "My grandmother always said music was just mathematics that had learned to dance, and mathematics is really just the universe talking to itself in its sleep." The sight of the obviously primitive instrument caused visible confusion among the Velthari delegation. Several of them exchanged glances that suggested they were rapidly recalculating their assumptions about human cultural development. "You wish to demonstrate combat prowess using a musical device?" one of the younger delegates asked, her voice carrying a note of genuine bewilderment. "Combat prowess might be overstating it," Dimitri replied, carefully removing the violin from its case. "I was thinking more along the lines of consciousness-assisted quantum field harmonization. Though I suppose it depends on how you define combat." As he began tuning the instrument, the training bay's quantum sensors started registering energy fluctuations that shouldn't have been possible from a device constructed entirely of organic materials and metal strings. The readings were subtle at first, barely distinguishable from background cosmic radiation, but they grew stronger with each adjustment Dimitri made to the violin's tuning pegs. Listenera's bioluminescent fingertips began pulsing more rapidly, apparently responding to frequencies that existed just below the threshold of human perception. "Your instrument is interfacing with quantum field fluctuations," she said, her voice carrying a note of scientific curiosity that overrode her earlier condescension. "Grandmother's violin always was a bit temperamental," Dimitri agreed, drawing the bow across the strings in a series of experimental notes. "She claimed it was made from wood that had been struck by lightning during a solar storm, though I always thought that was just a colorful way of saying the resonance chamber had unusual acoustic properties." The first few measures of melody that emerged from the violin were hauntingly beautiful, but they also did something that made every piece of sensitive equipment in the training bay start humming in sympathetic vibration. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated slightly, just enough to make everyone's stomach lurch in a brief moment of weightlessness. "Fascinating," Listenera murmured, her earlier arrogance replaced by scientific fascination. "The harmonic frequencies are somehow interfacing with our bioneural networks. How did you discover this application?" "Accidentally," Dimitri replied, continuing to play while carrying on the conversation as if quantum field manipulation was a perfectly normal side effect of practicing classical music. "I was trying to calm down a malfunctioning AI core during the Titan Station incident, and it turned out the computer was just lonely. The violin helped it process emotional algorithms it hadn't been designed to handle." The melody evolved into something more complex, and suddenly the bioluminescent patches on several Veltheri delegates began pulsing in perfect synchronization with the music. They looked down at their own bodies in alarm, clearly experiencing responses they couldn't control or explain. "This is impossible," one of them whispered, her elongated ears twitching rapidly as she tried to analyze what was happening to her biosystems. "Human consciousness shouldn't be able to interface with our quantum neural matrices." "Maybe it's not interfacing," Dimitri suggested, his bow moving across the strings in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles Vale didn't recognize. "Maybe it's just helping you remember that consciousness and quantum mechanics aren't actually separate phenomena." Listenera's perfect composure was now completely shattered. Her silver hair had begun to move in response to energy fields that the ship's sensors couldn't detect, and her bioluminescent fingertips were strobing in patterns that looked suspiciously like the visual representation of complex mathematical equations. "You're generating quantum entanglement through artistic expression," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of wonder and something that might have been fear. "The Veltheri have been trying to achieve stable consciousness quantum field integration for centuries, and you're accomplishing it with a primitive stringed instrument." "Well," Dimitri replied thoughtfully, transitioning into a melody that made the training bay's lights flicker in rhythm with the music, "when you put it like that, it does sound pretty impressive. Though I should probably mention that the violin isn't entirely primitive." He held up his prosthetic arm, which was now glowing with soft internal light that pulsed in harmony with the music. The mechanical components include quantum resonance amplifiers that were originally designed for deep space communication arrays. Turns out they work just as well for translating musical intervals into quantum field fluctuations. The revelation that the crude mechanical appendage the aliens had mocked was actually sophisticated technology disguised as primitive augmentation seemed to be the final straw for Listenera's worldview. She stared at the prosthetic arm as if seeing it for the first time, her elongated ears practically vibrating with shock. "You deliberately concealed the true nature of your technology," she accused, though her tone suggested admiration rather than anger. "Not concealed," Dimitri corrected, his bow dancing across the strings in patterns that were now causing the ship's quantum harmonics to resonate like a vast musical instrument. "Just didn't see any reason to show off. Besides, the real technology isn't in the hardware." As if to demonstrate his point, he began playing a melody so complex and beautiful that it seemed to exist in more dimensions than the training bay could properly contain. The music transcended mere sound, becoming something that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the consciousness of everyone present. For the first time since boarding the human vessel, the Velthari delegation fell completely silent, their bioluminescent biosystems pulsing in perfect harmony as they experienced something their advanced civilization had been unable to achieve through centuries of technological development. Commander Vale watched in amazement as her security chief accomplished more effective diplomatic outreach through a single musical performance than most ambassadors managed in entire careers. Though she made a mental note to have a serious conversation with him later about the importance of mentioning relevant qualifications during personnel reviews. The final notes of Dimitri's impossible melody lingered in the training bay's quantum-charged atmosphere like mathematical prayers waiting for answers. As the music faded, the synchronized pulsing of the Velthari biosystems gradually returned to their normal patterns, though several delegates continued staring at their own hands as if they belonged to strangers. Listenera stood frozen in the center of the training area, her silver hair still moving in response to energy fields that shouldn't have existed. When she finally spoke, her melodious voice carried none of its earlier arrogance. "The equation," she whispered, her elongated ears twitching with barely contained excitement. "The harmonic progression you played contains the solution to the Velthari consciousness paradox. How did you encode quantum mathematics into musical notation?" Dimitri carefully placed his violin back in its case, his prosthetic arms' quantum resonance amplifiers gradually dimming to their normal operational levels. "I didn't encode anything," he said with characteristic understatement. "The mathematics were already there. Music is just organized sound, and sound is organized vibration, and vibration is how the universe organizes itself. I just helped it along a little." Commander Vale felt as though she were witnessing the birth of an entirely new field of science, though knowing Dimitri, he would probably insist it was just an extension of his coffee brewing techniques taken to their logical extreme. "But this changes everything," one of the younger delegates said, her voice rising with scientific fervor. "If consciousness can interface directly with quantum fields through artistic expression, then the boundary between observer and observed becomes meaningless. Subjective experience and objective reality are revealed as artificial distinctions." "That does sound important," Dimitri agreed solemnly. "Though I should probably mention that the violin only works properly after the third cup of coffee. Before that, it mostly just sounds like a dying space whale with respiratory problems." The casual mention of caffeinated beverages in the context of revolutionary quantum consciousness theory seemed to restore some equilibrium to the conversation, though Listenera continued studying Dimitri as if he were a puzzle that had rearranged itself while she wasn't looking. "Your species approaches technological development through entirely different paradigms than we anticipated," she admitted, her earlier condescension replaced by something that might have been respect. "Where the Velthari sought to dominate natural forces through biological manipulation, humans appear to have learned to collaborate with them through intuitive integration. We're good at making friends with things that try to kill us," Dimitri confirmed. "It's either that or find new hobbies, and frankly, quantum mechanics is more interesting than most recreational activities. Plus it makes the coffee taste better." Vale realized she was watching the moment when two civilizations discovered they had been asking the same questions while approaching them from completely opposite directions. The Velthari had developed increasingly sophisticated biological technology to bridge the gap between consciousness and quantum reality, while humans had stumbled onto the same breakthrough through art, intuition, and apparently superior beverage preparation methods. "The implications for our respective societies are staggering," Listenera continued, her scientific excitement beginning to override centuries of cultural superiority conditioning. "Collaborative development between Velthari biotechnology and human consciousness quantum integration could revolutionize our understanding of reality itself." "Sounds like a lot of paperwork," Dimitri observed thoughtfully. "Though I suppose if we're going to be revolutionizing reality, we should probably do it properly. Will there be forms to fill out, or do we just shake hands and hope the universe doesn't file a complaint?" The younger delegate who had been most shocked by human surgical techniques now laughed with genuine delight. "I think I'm beginning to understand why your species survived long enough to achieve interstellar capability," she said. You treat cosmic mysteries like bureaucratic inconveniences that can be resolved through practical problem solving and adequate refreshment preparation. It's worked so far, Dmitri agreed. Though to be fair, we haven't tried applying it to truly serious problems yet, like figuring out how to make alien coffee that doesn't taste like recycled atmospheric processors. Listenera's laugh was completely different from her earlier crystal chime mockery. This time it carried warmth and genuine appreciation for the absurdity of discussing interstellar diplomacy through the lens of beverage quality control. Perhaps, she said slowly, the Veltheri have been approaching civilization from an unnecessarily complicated perspective. We developed quantum consciousness integration technology because we believed it would demonstrate our intellectual superiority. You accomplished the same breakthrough because you wanted to comfort a lonely artificial intelligence. And improve the coffee, Dmitri added helpfully. Let's not forget the coffee. That was actually the primary objective. The quantum consciousness integration was more of an unexpected bonus. Commander Vale stepped forward, recognizing that this was the moment when diplomatic protocols either evolved into something entirely new or collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. Ambassador, she said formally, on behalf of humanity, I would like to propose a joint research initiative between our species. It appears we have complementary approaches to problems that neither of us can solve alone. The Veltheri Collective would be honored to participate in such collaboration, Listenera replied, her tone carrying the weight of official diplomatic language. Though I confess we may need to revise our understanding of what constitutes advanced civilization. Most advanced civilizations probably have better coffee than we do, Dmitri pointed out reasonably. So there's still room for improvement on both sides. The training bay's quantum sensors had finally stabilized, though they continued registering energy fluctuations that would require entirely new categories of scientific classification. Vale made a mental note to have the ship's science officers prepare comprehensive reports, though she suspected most of their findings would be classified under impossible but reproducible phenomena, until theoretical physics caught up with practical applications. There is one question that troubles me, Listenera said, her elongated ears twitching with residual confusion. If your prosthetic arm contains quantum resonance technology sophisticated enough to interface with consciousness fields, why did you allow us to mock it as primitive augmentation? Dimitri's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the question. Because primitive and sophisticated aren't mutually exclusive categories, he said finally. The quantum amplifiers are built into a framework designed to open jars and make coffee. High-tech solutions to practical problems aren't less valuable because they serve everyday needs. And because, he added with a slight smile, it's often useful to let people underestimate you until you know whether they're going to be friends or filing insurance claims. The admission that humanity had been conducting a subtle intelligence assessment throughout the entire diplomatic encounter seemed to be the final piece of the puzzle for Listenera. Her people had arrived expecting to find charming primitives who would be appropriately awed by Veltheri technological superiority. Instead, they had discovered a species that camouflaged revolutionary breakthroughs as mundane practical applications while evaluating alien intentions through the medium of casual conversation. Your species is far more sophisticated than our preliminary assessments suggested, she admitted. Though I suspect sophistication might not be the correct term for what you've accomplished. We prefer, creatively practical, Dmitri suggested. It sounds less intimidating than accidentally revolutionary, and it leaves room for improvement through better coffee preparation methods. As the Veltheri delegation prepared to return to their crystalline ship, the atmosphere in the training bay had transformed completely. What had begun as a confrontation between allegedly primitive humans and obviously superior aliens had evolved into the foundation of an alliance based on mutual respect and complementary approaches to understanding the universe. Commander Vale watched Listenera carefully pack away her holographic projection equipment while engaging in animated discussion with Dmitri about the theoretical applications of musical mathematics to biological enhancement technologies. The ambassador's elongated ears no longer twitched with nervous energy but moved in thoughtful patterns that suggested she was already planning collaborative research proposals. Commander, Listenera said as the delegation prepared to phase shift back through the hull plating, I believe this diplomatic encounter has exceeded all possible expectations. The Veltheri Collective looks forward to learning how human consciousness quantum integration principles might enhance our biotechnology development. And we're looking forward to learning how Veltheri biological systems might improve our coffee, Dmitri added seriously. Because if we're going to be revolutionizing reality on a regular basis, we're definitely going to need better beverages. The last thing Vale saw before the aliens melted back through the ship's hull was Lisanera's expression of delighted bewilderment at the realization that humanity's approach to cosmic mysteries would always include practical considerations like refreshment quality and insurance coverage. It was, she reflected, probably the most successful first contact in the history of interstellar diplomacy, even if the official reports were going to read like science fiction comedy rather than serious diplomatic documentation.